Now, the structure of the global monetary system, it might sound like a chaotic mess full of randomness and misconceptions, but international trade and exchange rates have a certain structure to them. They're built and enforced by the hegemonic powers that exist during any given era. In other words, at any given time, an empire or set of powerful countries work together to enforce a rules-based global order on how international trade works and, more importantly, how it is priced. However, there is inherently an economic entropy within any system, as order gradually frays into disorder. Global monetary systems can be long-lasting but never permanent, as the global center of power shifts over time and as bottlenecks and imperfections in the system grow to unsustainable levels and resulting in increasing levels of disorder. A system gradually or abruptly gets reordered into another system. Ironically, it's often not an external threat that brings down the existing order, it's the flaws within that system left unchecked that eventually expand enough to bring it down and necessitate a reordering, either from the same ruling regime or from a new regime that displaces it. Over the past century, for example, the world went from a gold standard system to the bretton-woods system to the petrodollar system. Each system mostly unraveled from within rather than being brought down externally, and each time this one system transitioned into another, a significant and widespread currency devaluation occurred. Now, we'll start with the gold standard. This is pretty much the pervasive monetary system before 1944. For much of human existence, economies were based on trade, furs, oysters, olive oil for spices, labor for bread, etc., etc. Now, the mining of precious metals like gold and silver made that simpler, and these metals have been considered money for thousands of years. With precious metals, you could turn a specific commodity like furs into a universal commodity like gold and silver, which are rare, long-lasting, and are able to be broken down into small measurable units, to buy whatever you want at any later date. From there, paper currency and credit was added as a more convenient layer onto gold. Gold itself could be held securely in vaults, paper slips representing a share that gold could be used for as a medium of exchange. Sometimes they were issued by private banks, and in modern times they were generally issued by sovereign governments. In this sense, governments would issue paper currencies that is backed by gold held in central bank vaults. From that point, we saw the rise of global reserve currencies, referring to either papers or precious metal currencies of trading or military empires that were recognized and accepted in many countries outside their own homeland. The Roman Empire was an ancient example. More recently, the Dutch Empire also was a great example of that, and that was followed by the United Kingdom. Now, the United States today is the ruling empire. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, the United Kingdom had a mantle of the most globally recognized currency, although it existed within a system of many currencies being backed by gold. During these centuries, the center of global power mostly rested within Europe, and its precise epicenter shifting over time, and wars within Europe played a huge role in its eventual replacement. Under this gold standard system, exchange rates between currencies still shifted over time for various reasons, with the balance of power being a key variable. Now, there is a huge reason behind all this, but I'll keep it simple. The crux of it is that whenever a country began persistently importing more than it was exporting, it risked having gold flow out of the country and risked economic stagnation within the homeland. This is why trade deficits matter. Ultimately, however, the state would usually be self-correcting because a recession would eventually devalue their currency, which would make their exports more competitive and imports more expensive, and thus realign their export and import balance. In the later stages of the system, all major nations devalued their currencies sharply and reset or suspended their gold pegs. Now, the winners of the world wars devalued their currencies less than others, but everyone always devalued. This was partly from the wars, but also just as much from the end of a long-term debt cycle. Now we enter the Bretton-Woods system, which is spanning from 1944 to 1971. The most recent handover of global reserve currency status gradually began after World War I and was finalized in the later stages of World War II. As a result of the wars, the rise of the American economy and the center of global power shifted from Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom, to the United States. In the 1930s, the United States government made gold ownership illegal and forced citizens to sell their gold to the government, which allowed the system and the government to build up huge gold reserves. Then, In order to keep gold safe during the war, many countries shipped their gold to the United States, so the United States had its own massive gold stockpile and also served as a global gold custodian for many allies. As World War II unfolded, Europe and East Asia were devastated by the war. Now, the United States' homeland was barely touched, and the US became the world's largest creditor nation in the process. At that point, the bretton-woods system was established, whereby the United States backed its dollar by gold, and dozens of other countries pegged their currencies to the dollar, and thus also had a gold standard by association. Many countries held US treasuries as a form of reserve collateral that was good as gold. The dollar was not redeemable by US citizens for gold, but it was redeemable to foreign governments for gold. So other countries could get gold for their dollars, just not US citizens. Now, during this time, the United States also began laying the groundwork for its alliance with Saudi Arabia, which would come into play within the next system. This period also saw the rise of the euro-dollar market, referring to the dollar market that exists between banks and other entities outside the United States and outside of the Federal Reserve's jurisdiction, primarily centered in Europe, but extending throughout the world. With the Bretton-Woods system and the following petrodollar system, the United States obtained a near-global lock on the international money system. Previous empire currencies never obtained that complete of a financial lock on the world, and thus were never a true quote-unquote global reserve currency, but instead were just widely recognized and dominant currencies. Now, from 1944 to today, the status of the dollar as the global reserve currency is not perfectly comparable to pre-1944 periods of other global reserve currencies, because this period is really different. It's unique. It was the first time technology allowed the entire world to be connected enough for a truly global war to happen and for a truly global monetary system to come in its wake. However, after only 1 decade, the Bretton-Woods system began to break down. The United States began running a large fiscal deficit and experienced mildly rising inflation levels, and first for the late 1960s and the domestic programs that brought about, and then for the Vietnam War. Now, the United States began to see its gold reserve shrink as other countries began to doubt the backing of the US dollar and therefore redeem their dollars for gold instead of comfortably holding dollars. This chart shows US gold reserves as measured in metric tons during that time. In fact, the numbers show that from inception, it was already an unstable path. The US began the system with more gold than foreign liabilities, but the gap quickly began closing the first few years. Now, by the 1950s and the late 1950s, US external liabilities exceeded US gold reserves. By the mid-1960s, a subset of US external liabilities that were owed to foreign officials exceeded the US gold reserves, which was the true crossover point where the system became truly troubled. And by 1971, the system broke down and was defaulted on by the United States. The system had an underlying flaw when left unaddressed, brought the system down. It was never truly sustainable as designed. There was no way that the US could maintain enough gold to back all of its currency for domestic use and simultaneously back enough currency for expanding global use as well. Now, some economists such as Robert Triffin explicitly warned about this problem to Congress and the business world in what became known as the Triffin Dilemma. It was a foreseeable problem, in other words. The same thing happened to the United Kingdom in the early 1900s and prior to World War II and World War I. John Keane saw the problem ahead of time too and proposed an alternative system called Bancor, where the international unit of account based on gold and a basket of major currencies would be used to settle balances of trade and would be held as a central bank reserve asset. This would be an inherently more balanced system with a neutral settlement mechanism rather than centering everything on the currency of one country. However, politics often wins over the math, and at least at first, the Bretton-Woods system won over the other ideas. Something like Bancor was enacted on by the IMF as well, with units called SDRs that are a basket of major currencies that are held by central banks, but it never really had enough support to catch on in any more than a limited way. Eventually, in 1971, math came back with a vengeance on the Bretton-Woods system. The closing of gold convertibility was proposed to be temporary at the time, but it was ultimately becoming permanent. Rather than shifting to another country though, the United States was able to reorder the global monetary system with itself still in the center in the next system. Ultimately, all major currencies, including the dollar, devalued radically versus gold and other hard assets in the 1970s. This continued to be the major trend of the currency devaluations happening whenever the global monetary system gets reordered. Usually, the same forces that break the system also break the currency itself. When that happens, the quantity of broad money supply goes up significantly, and the purchasing power of existing debts gets partially inflated away. Hey guys, sorry to end the video so abruptly there. I've been working on this for a minute and I want to keep things around 10 minutes. That was the kind of the history of the United States monetary system from 1900s up until 1971. Now we're heading into the much controversial petrodollar system, which explains a lot of our foreign policy decisions since 1970. Including our alliances with Saudi Arabia and a lot of stuff many people don't really understand about not just the politics within the US, but global politics in general. I think this is the more eye-opening part of the series that is definitely going to benefit you, not only monetarily to know these things, but just to understand kind of how the global order is constructed, because this is we're at the tail end of it, but it is still the monetary system that is most pervasive today, and we have countries like Russia and China actively undermining the system. But yeah, you can tune in, make sure you subscribe, like, comment, just to make sure you get these videos. Yeah, and I only upload maybe once every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, because I really want to put in the work on these videos. So thank you for lasting this long, watching, and have a good one.